The hidden realm, where the forgotten gods dwelled, was a place unlike any other, a realm suspended between time and space, woven together by the fading threads of memory and belief. It was a world where the echoes of worship still lingered in the air, faint as the dying embers of a long-forgotten fire. Once resplendent with the brilliance of divine energy, the realm had now withered into a shadow of its former self, much like its inhabitants. Alecto, one of the three Furies, sat perched on the jagged edge of a cliff that overlooked a desolate landscape. The skies above were a perpetual twilight, neither day nor night, but a stagnant void where the stars had long since dimmed. The land below, once teeming with life and divine architecture, was now barren and lifeless. Temples dedicated to gods from every culture stood in ruins, their grandeur reduced to crumbling stones and broken columns. Alecto's once vibrant wings, dark and leathery, were now tattered and frayed at the edges. She gazed out into the distance, her eyes, fiery coals of wrath in the old days, now dulled with despair. Her sisters, Tisiphone and Megaura, had long since retreated into the depths of the underworld, seeking solace in the shadows. But Alecto remained, bound by duty, a sentinel in a world where there was nothing left to guard. Her fingers traced the hilt of her sword, a blade that had once been the bane of the wicked and the unrighteous. Now, it was little more than a relic, its edge dulled by centuries of disuse. She remembered the days when her name was spoken in hushed tones, when mortals feared the judgment she brought upon them. But those days were gone, buried beneath the sands of time. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie. Alecto turned to see a figure approaching, his form familiar yet changed. It was Hermes, the messenger of the gods, though he no longer bore the wings upon his sandals that had once carried him across the world. His once youthful face was lined with age, and the mischievous spark in his eyes had dimmed. Alecto, Hermes greeted her with a weary nod, his voice lacking the playful lilt it once had. Still watching over the realm I see. Someone has to, Alecto replied, her voice rough from disuse. What brings you here? Hermes, have you come to mock the remnants of our glory? Hermes shook his head. No, Alecto. I come with news that may change our fate. Alecto arched an eyebrow, skepticism etched into her features. And what fate do we have left? Hermes, we are the forgotten, the castaways of a world that no longer believes in us. There is a prophecy, Hermes began, his tone somber, one that speaks of a way to reclaim what was lost. It is written in the ancient texts of the Fates, hidden within their sanctum. I found it by chance. Or perhaps by design. Alecto's interest piqued, despite herself. A prophecy? Hermes reached into the folds of his tattered cloak and produced a scroll, yellowed with age. He handed it to Alecto, who unfurled it with care. The words, written in a language older than time itself, seemed to glow faintly, as if imbued with a remnant of the divine power they once held. The prophecy speaks of the heart of the cosmos. Hermes explained as Alecto read, an artifact with the power to restore our strength, to make us whole once more. But it is hidden in the mortal realm, guarded by trials that only the bravest of us can overcome. Alecto's eyes flickered with a hint of the old fire. And you believe this artifact exists? That it can truly restore what we have lost? I do, Hermes said, his voice steady. It is our only chance, Alecto. If we do not act, we will fade into oblivion, mere memories in the annals of history. Alecto stared at the scroll, the weight of its words heavy in her hands. She could feel the stirrings of something long buried deep within her. Hope mingled with a simmering rage at the injustice of their fate. If there was even the slightest chance to reclaim their power, to remind the world of their existence, she would take it. Who else knows of this? Alecto asked, her voice firm. No one yet. Hermes replied, I came to you first, knowing that you would understand the gravity of this situation. Then we must gather the others, Alecto decided, her mind already racing with plans. We will need the strongest among us, those who have not yet succumbed to despair. Hermes nodded. I thought the same. There are still those who cling to the remnants of their power, waiting for a chance to rise again. Alecto rose to her feet, her wings unfurling with a snap. The wind, stagnant for so long, stirred as if in response to her renewed resolve. Then let us begin. We have no time to waste. The first on their list was Loki, the trickster god of Norse mythology. Once the bane of gods and mortals alike, Loki had been reduced to little more than a shadow, his mischief dulled by the passage of time. He resided in a remote corner of the realm, in a place where the boundaries between reality and illusion blurred, much like his own nature. Alecto and Hermes arrived at Loki's domain, a labyrinthine forest of twisted trees and shifting shadows. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath their feet was soft, as if it might give way at any moment. Alecto felt the familiar sense of unease that always accompanied Loki's presence, but she pressed on, her resolve unshaken. They found Loki seated upon a throne of gnarled roots, his form draped in a cloak of darkness. His once fiery hair had faded to a dull red, and his eyes, once alight with cunning, now held a glimmer of boredom. Yet there was a sharpness to him still, a sense that beneath the surface lay a mind ever plotting, ever scheming. Well, Loki drawled as they approached. What brings the fury and the messenger to my humble abode? Have you come to play a game, perhaps? Enough games, Loki, Alecto said, her tone curt. We come with news, a chance to reclaim what we have lost. Loki arched an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Reclaim, you say? How intriguing. Do tell. Hermes stepped forward, recounting the prophecy and the quest for the heart of the cosmos. Loki listened with feigned disinterest, though Alecto could see the gears turning in his mind. When Hermes finished, Loki leaned back in his throne, steepling his fingers. A quest for an artifact of immense power, guarded by trials most deadly, Loki mused. It sounds like the sort of thing that would make for an entertaining distraction. This is not a game, Loki, Alecto warned, her eyes narrowing. If we fail, we are finished. This is our last chance. Loki's smirk widened, which is precisely why it's so interesting. Very well, Alecto Hermes. I shall join your little crusade, but know this, I do nothing for free. When we find this heart of the cosmos, I expect a share of its power. Agreed, Alecto said, though she knew better than to trust Loki's promises. For now, they needed him, and that was enough. With Loki's agreement secured, the trio departed from his domain, the shadows shifting uneasily in their wake. Alecto knew that Loki's involvement would complicate things, but she also knew that his cunning might be the key to overcoming the trials ahead. As they traveled, Hermes began to speak of their next destination. Their journey took them to the far reaches of the realm, where the borders of the underworld bled into the land of the living. Here, amidst the endless sands of the desert, they sought Anubis, the Egyptian god of the dead. Once the revered guide of souls, Anubis had withdrawn into solitude, guarding the gates of the afterlife with an unwavering dedication. The desert was a place of silence and stillness, where the only sound was the whisper of the wind as it carried the sands across the dunes. As they approached Anubis's domain, the landscape shifted, becoming a vast necropolis of ancient tombs and towering obelisks. The air grew heavier as Alecto, Hermes, and Loki approached the entrance to the necropolis where Anubis had made his eternal home. In this forsaken corner of the forgotten god's realm, time moved differently, slower, languid, as if each moment was weighed down by the unrelenting press of the dead. The sun, forever suspended on the horizon, cast long, ominous shadows that stretched across the desolate landscape, dancing along the ancient tombs like forgotten memories, reaching out for something lost. At the center of it all stood Anubis. He was still as a statue, his towering, jackal-headed figure unmoving, regal. His dark fur seemed to absorb the light, and his golden robes, tattered and faded, fluttered slightly in the whispering wind. In his hand, he held a tall staff topped with an ankh, its once bright metal now tarnished, yet still unmistakably divine. His eyes, however, remained as luminous as ever, two burning orbs of emerald fire that held within them the knowledge of every soul he had ever guided to the afterlife. He was the silent guardian, the ferryman of the dead, and the keeper of secrets that no living god or mortal could ever hope to understand. As the trio approached, Anubis's gaze fixed on them with a quiet, unnerving intensity. He did not move, but his presence was overwhelming, as if the very weight of eternity pressed down on Alecto and her companions. Alecto, Hermes, Loki. His voice, when he finally spoke, was like the rumble of an earthquake, deep and unyielding, reverberating through the sands of the desert. You come to me with purpose. Speak. Alecto stepped forward, her boots sinking slightly into the sand as she did so. She had faced gods and mortals alike in the heat of battle, but Anubis was different. There was a stillness to him that Anubis was different, that unnerved even her, as if he had long transcended the petty desires that drove other gods. We seek the heart of the cosmos, Alecto said, her voice steady. A prophecy speaks of an artifact that can restore our power, bring us back from the edge of oblivion. Anubis's gaze did not waver. I know of the prophecy. This revelation caught Alecto off guard, though she did not show it. You know? How? I am the guardian of the dead. Anubis said, his voice carrying the weight of eons. I have watched the souls of men and gods alike pass through my realm. Some whisper of the heart, others cry out in their fear. I know many things, Fury. Then you understand why we are here. Hermes interjected, his tone respectful but urgent. If we can find the heart, we can reclaim our strength, our purpose. Anubis's gaze shifted to Hermes, his eyes narrowing slightly. Purpose. You speak of purpose, messenger, but tell me this. What purpose have you, or any of us? Left in this world, the mortals have turned their backs on us. The mortals have turned their backs on us. They no longer remember our names, nor do they call upon us in their prayers. They may not remember, Alecto said, stepping forward, but that does not mean we are finished. If we find the heart, we can remind them of who we are, what we are. For a long moment, Anubis was silent, his glowing eyes searching Alecto's face. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned and began walking toward the mausoleum behind him. The sound of his footsteps was soft against the sand, but it seemed to echo as if he were walking through a vast, empty tomb. Follow, he said simply. Alecto exchanged a glance with Hermes and Loki before they followed Anubis into the mausoleum. The entrance was flanked by two massive statues, their features worn away by time but still unmistakably divine, figures of gods long forgotten. The doors were made of black stone, engraved with hieroglyphs that spoke of death, judgment, and the passage of the soul. Inside, the air was cool, and the walls were lined with torches that flickered with a strange greenish light. The floor was smooth, polished stone, and the ceiling stretched high above, disappearing into darkness. As they walked deeper into the tomb, the silence became oppressive, broken only by the soft sound of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from somewhere unseen. Anubis led them through a series of winding corridors, each one more intricate and more foreboding than the last. At times, the walls seemed to close in around them, the air growing thin and stale. At other times, the path opened up into vast chambers filled with the remnants of ancient rituals, altars covered in dust, crumbling statues, and offerings long since abandoned. Finally, they came to a halt before a massive stone door, its surface engraved with the image of a great scale. One side of the scale was empty. The other held a single feather. "This is the gate of souls," Anubis said, turning to face them. It is here that the dead are judged. Those whose hearts are heavier than the feather are cast into the abyss. Those who are found worthy may pass on to the afterlife. And what does this have to do with the heart? Loki asked, his tone laced with impatience. Anubis fixed his gaze on the trickster god. The heart of the cosmos is hidden behind this gate, but it is not I who can open it. Only those who have faced their own judgment and emerged victorious may pass through. Alecto felt a chill run down her spine. You mean we have to? Yes, Anubis said, his voice grave. You must face the weight of your own souls. The gate will test you. It will show you the truth of who you are. Loki scoffed. Oh, please. Another test? Do we not have enough trials ahead of us? Anubis's eyes flared with a dangerous light. This is no simple test. Trickster, this is the judgment of the gods. If you fail, you will not simply be denied passage. You will be consumed by the darkness that lies beyond. For the first time, Alecto saw a flicker of hesitation in Loki's eyes. She could not blame him. The weight of one's soul was not a matter to be taken lightly. Even she, a fury, had her doubts about what the gate would reveal. Anubis stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. When you are ready, step forward. Alecto took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had faced countless battles, judged the souls of mortals, and enacted the will of the gods. But this was something different. This was not about punishment or retribution. This was about truth. And truth was far more terrifying than any sword or spear. She stepped forward, placing her hand on the cold stone of the door. The moment her skin touched the surface, the engravings of the scale began to glow with an eerie, golden light. The air around her grew heavy, and the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. The walls of the mausoleum faded away, replaced by darkness, an all-consuming void that swallowed her whole. For a moment, Alecto felt nothing. No sound, no sight, no sensation. She was adrift in a sea of emptiness, cut off from everything, and then slowly the darkness gave way to light. She was no longer in the mausoleum. She stood in a vast open field, the grass beneath her feet soft and cool. The sky above was a deep, endless blue, dotted with wisps of white clouds. A gentle breeze brushed against her skin, carrying with it the scent of earth and flowers. Alecto frowned. This was not what she had expected. She had been prepared for fire and brimstone, for a trial of pain and suffering. But this was peaceful, serene, too serene. As she took a step forward, she noticed something in the distance. A figure, standing alone at the edge of the field. The figure was facing away from her, their back turned, but there was something familiar about them. Something that made Alecto's heart tighten in her chest. She began to walk toward the figure, her footsteps slow and cautious. As she drew closer, she saw that the figure was a woman, dressed in a simple white gown. Her hair was dark and flowing, cascading down her back like a river of shadow. and then, as if sensing Alecto's approach, the woman turned. Alecto froze. The woman's face was her own. No, not quite. There were differences, subtle but unmistakable. The woman's eyes were softer, her expression kinder. There was no trace of the rage, the bitterness that had defined Alecto for so long. "Who are you?" Alecto demanded, her voice trembling despite herself. The woman smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I am you. Or rather, I am what you were." "What I was," Alecto repeated, her brow furrowing. "I don't understand." The woman stepped closer, her gaze gentle but unwavering. Before the furies, before the anger, while Alecto faced her judgment within the ancient gate of souls, Loki paced the sand-covered floor of the mausoleum. His sharp eyes darted between the intricate hieroglyphs that decorated the stone walls, and he felt the weight of anticipation settling on him. He could never admit it, but the thought of being judged, of standing before the truth of his own soul, filled him with a dread that even his most devious tricks could not dispel. "I see you're nervous, trickster," Hermes remarked, leaning casually against the far wall, his arms crossed. He was watching Loki with a calm intensity, his gaze unwavering. "Nervous?" Loki smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Hardly. It's the waiting I dislike." Hermes' lips curled in a slight smile, knowing better than to press the matter. The gods had their pride, and Loki's was especially fragile. Anubis stood by the massive stone door, silent and still. His role was that of a witness, a guardian of the dead and the keeper of judgments. His expression betrayed nothing. He had seen countless souls pass through these gates, both god and mortal alike. This was but another trial to him, but even he knew that the gods before him were no ordinary beings. The door to the gate of souls shimmered faintly, its ancient magic pulsing with a slow rhythm, as if the very stone was breathing. Alecto was still inside, confronting the deepest truths of her existence. Time moved differently within the gate, and there was no way of knowing how long her trial would take. Each moment felt stretched, taut, like a thread about to snap. Loki stopped pacing, turning to face the door, his expression unreadable. His mind, however, was racing. He had always prided himself on being in control of every situation, on bending reality to his will with tricks, lies, and misdirection. But here, in this forsaken realm where the forgotten gods dwelled, none of his usual tools would help him. In the heart of his soul, Loki was not afraid of being judged for his mischief or trickery. No, what gnawed at him was the fear that beneath all the masks and illusions he had crafted over millennia, he might find nothing at all. "What do you expect to find?" Hermes asked, his voice quiet but probing. Loki's eyes flickered to Hermes, sharp as a blade. "You're awfully curious for a messenger. Don't you have a soul to deliver or some Olympian errand to run?" Hermes chuckled softly, shaking his head. Always the deflection, always the humor, and always the critic. Loki shot back. "But tell me, Hermes, what do you see when you look in the mirror? The obedient lapdog of the Olympians, running at their beck and call, delivering their messages. Do you ever tire of being a servant? Hermes' smile faded, and a shadow passed over his face. We all serve something, Loki, even you. Loki opened his mouth to retort, but the words died on his tongue. The door to the gate of souls trembled, and the stone began to shift. A low, rumbling sound filled the mausoleum as the ancient mechanism stirred to life. The great door groaned as it slowly creaked open, and a gust of cold air rushed out from the darkness beyond. Alecto stepped out. Her face was pale, her wings dragging slightly behind her as she crossed the threshold back into the mausoleum. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes darkened by whatever revelations she had faced within the gate. There was a heaviness to her now, a weight that had not been there before. Without a word, Alecto walked past Hermes and Loki, her footsteps echoing in the silent chamber. She came to a stop before Anubis, her gaze meeting his. "It is done," she said quietly, her voice strained. "I pass the judgment." Anubis inclined his head slightly. "Then the gate has accepted you. You may continue." Alecto nodded, but there was no triumph in her posture, no relief. Whatever she had seen inside the gate had left its mark, and it was clear that the trial had taken its toll. Loki watched her with narrowed eyes, his curiosity piqued. What could have shaken the unyielding fury? He opened his mouth to ask, but thought better of it. Whatever had happened inside the gate, it was Alecto's burden to bear. "Who's next?" Hermes asked, his gaze flickering between Loki and himself. "I'll go," Loki said quickly, stepping forward before Hermes could even offer. He flashed a grin, though there was a sharpness in his eyes. "Can't let the messenger boy beat me to it." "How can I?" Anubis gestured toward the door, and Loki, with a flourish, approached the threshold. The moment he stepped through, the stone shimmered once again, sealing him inside. Loki found himself in total darkness. Unlike Alecto's judgment, where a serene landscape had greeted her, Loki was enveloped in nothingness. It was a void, empty, cold, and silent. For the first time in a long while, there were no tricks, no illusions, no lies to comfort him. It was just him and the abyss. He stood still, waiting for something to happen. But as the moments dragged on, the silence stretched longer, suffocating him. His heart began to pound in his chest, and his breathing quickened. Then a single voice broke through the void. "Who are you?" It was soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed in the darkness like thunder. Loki turned toward the sound, but there was nothing, no figure, no form. Just the voice. "I am Loki," he said, his voice confident, though it felt hollow in the emptiness. "God of mischief, trickster of the Aesir, father of..." "Who are you?" The voice cut through his words, sharper this time, demanding. Loki frowned, a sense of unease creeping into his bones. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came. The darkness seemed to close in around him, suffocating, pressing in on all sides. A light appeared in the distance, dim at first, but growing brighter. Loki squinted, trying to make out what it was. As it drew closer, he saw that it was not a light at all, but a reflection. A mirror. It hovered before him, suspended in the air, its surface smooth and flawless. Loki stared at it, his heart pounding. He had looked into mirrors before, countless times. But this one was different. There was something in it that unnerved him, something that made him want to turn away. But he couldn't. The reflection in the mirror showed Loki as he was. Tall, lithe, with sharp features and a sly grin. His eyes glinted with mischief, and his form was draped in his usual attire. Fine clothes, rich with color and texture. But as he stared at himself, the image began to shift. His reflection smiled, a wicked, crooked smile that Loki recognized all too well. It was the smile he had used to deceive, to manipulate, to twist the truth to his own ends. But now, seeing it from the outside, it looked hollow, forced, as if it were a mask. The reflection leaned closer, and Loki's heart raced. He tried to step back, but his feet were rooted to the ground. "You wear so many masks, trickster," the reflection whispered, its voice soft and mocking. "But which one is truly yours?" Loki swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "I am..." "Who are you really?" The reflection interrupted, its eyes gleaming with malice. Beneath the lies, beneath the tricks, what are you? Nothing. You are nothing. Loki's breath caught in his throat. The mirror's surface began to ripple like water, and the reflection twisted, distorting into a grotesque version of himself. His features stretched, his grin widening into something monstrous. His eyes, once filled with cunning, were now hollow and empty, like black pits that threatened to consume him. "No," Loki whispered, his voice shaking. "That's not me." "Isn't it?" The reflection taunted. "You've spent your entire existence crafting lies, weaving illusions. But here, in the void, there is no trick to hide behind, no one to deceive. You are alone, Loki. And without your lies, you are nothing." Loki clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his chest. The void pressed in closer, suffocating him, and the mirror loomed larger, filling his vision. "No," he said again, louder this time. "I am not nothing." The reflection's grin widened, and it began to laugh, a cold, cruel sound that echoed through the darkness. "You are a fraud," the reflection hissed, "a coward. You hide behind your tricks because you are too afraid to face the truth. But now there is no hiding, no running. Look at yourself, Loki. Look at what you really are." Loki's hands trembled at his sides, and for a moment he was paralyzed. Loki's reflection was no longer the cunning, confident god he prided himself on being. What stared back at him was a grotesque, distorted figure, his face stretched into an unnatural grin. his eyes wide and empty, pools of nothingness that seemed to consume all light. The more he gazed into the mirror, the more the image reflected everything he feared about himself, all the cracks he had papered over with trickery and charm. The laughter from his reflection filled the void, a cacophony of mockery that echoed in Loki's mind like 1,000 knives cutting through his thoughts. It wasn't the sound that hurt him, though. It was the truth embedded in it. He had always prided himself on being the master of deception, the one who could see through others' facades while keeping his own securely in place. But now, here, stripped of his illusions, the reflection showed him what lay underneath, and it terrified him. "Stop it," Loki whispered, his voice cracking. "Stop it." The reflection didn't waver. If anything, it leaned closer, its monstrous grin widening until it threatened to split the face apart. The eyes, those horrible, empty eyes, locked onto Loki, and the trickster god felt himself paralyzed by their gaze. "You can't run from this," the reflection hissed, its voice slithering into Loki's ears. "No more hiding, no more games. This is who you are." Loki clenched his fists, his fingernails digging into the palms of his hands. "I am Loki," he growled, trying to regain control of himself. "God of mischief, trickster, father of monsters, master of chaos." Master of chaos. The reflection's laugh grew even darker, the mirror rippling like disturbed water. A title to hide your fear. Chaos is a mask you wear, Loki. A mask to cover the nothingness underneath. The word echoed again. And nothing. It reverberated through the void, and Loki felt it burrowing into his mind, sinking into the cracks of his self-image like a poisonous whisper. He tried to move, to tear his eyes away from the reflection, but his body refused to respond. The void was suffocating him, pressing down on him from every direction, as if the emptiness itself was trying to consume him. "I am more than this," Loki murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. He could feel the doubt creeping in, gnawing at the edges of his mind. What if the reflection was right? What if the reflection was right? What if underneath all the tricks, the lies, and the illusions, there really was nothing? Nothing but fear. Nothing but a hollow shell, pretending to be more than it was. "Are you?" The reflection challenged, its voice a low, mocking whisper. The mirror began to pulse, the surface shimmering with a dark, oily sheen. Loki watched in horror as the distorted image of himself began to seep out of the glass like black ink spreading across the surface of reality. The reflection's form was no longer confined to the mirror. It was emerging from the void, stepping out of the glass and into the space around him. The darkness coalesced into a figure, a twisted doppelganger of Loki, but larger, more monstrous. Its grin stretched unnaturally wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and its body seemed to flicker and shift as though it were made of shadow and smoke. "You call yourself the god of mischief," the doppelganger sneered, its voice dripping with contempt. But where is your mischief now? Where are your tricks, your clever words? Loki took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The doppelganger advanced on him, its footsteps silent but heavy with malice. Every instinct in Loki's body screamed at him to flee, to escape this nightmare, but there was nowhere to run. The void stretched on endlessly, a vast, suffocating abyss that offered no refuge. I don't need tricks to deal with you, Loki spat, trying to summon his usual bravado, but the words felt empty, hollow even to his own ears. The doppelganger laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Oh, but you do. It's all you have, Loki. Without your tricks, you are nothing. The word struck him again. Nothing. And Loki felt a cold chill run down his spine. He tried to summon his magic, his illusions, anything to fight back. But the void seemed to sap his strength, leaving him powerless. The doppelganger continued to advance, its twisted grin widening. You've spent your entire existence running from the truth, hiding behind lies, weaving stories to make yourself seem larger than life. But deep down, you know the truth, don't you? Loki's throat tightened, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I know who I am, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you? The doppelganger taunted. Or have you forgotten, lost in your own web of lies? The creature lunged at him, and Loki staggered back, his heart racing. He threw up his hands in a feeble attempt to defend himself, but the doppelganger was faster. It grabbed him by the throat, its fingers cold and unyielding like iron, and lifted him off the ground. Loki's legs kicked wildly as he struggled to breathe. The doppelganger's face was inches from his own, its empty, soulless eyes boring into him. Look at yourself, it hissed. Look at what you've become. The void around them shifted, and suddenly Loki was surrounded by images, flashes of his past, scenes of his greatest deceptions and betrayals. He saw himself tricking the gods of Asgard, playing cruel pranks on Thor, leading the frost giants into battle, and betraying everyone who had ever trusted him. Each image cut deeper than the last, a relentless barrage of reminders of his failures, his selfishness, his lies. The doppelganger tightened its grip on his throat, and Loki gasped for air, his vision swimming. You have spent your life pretending to be something you're not, the doppelganger whispered. You are not a god. You are not a hero. You are not even a villain. You are nothing but a coward. No, Loki coked, his voice strangled. I am. The doppelganger squeezed tighter, cutting him off. You are nothing. With a final, vicious twist, the doppelganger flung Loki to the ground. He landed hard, the air knocked out of him, his body trembling with pain. He lay there, gasping for breath as the doppelganger loomed over him, its shadow stretching across the void. For the first time in his life, Loki felt truly powerless. The doppelganger crouched down, its cold, cruel smile never wavering. This is who you are, Loki, not the god of mischief. Not the god of mischief, Just a scared little boy hiding behind lies and illusions. Loki closed his eyes, his heart heavy with despair. He had always prided himself on being clever, on being able to outsmart anyone, but now, faced with the truth of his own soul, he realized how hollow that pride truly was. The void seemed to close in around him, and for a moment, Loki thought he might disappear into it, swallowed by the darkness that had always been lurking just beneath the surface. But then, something stirred deep within him, a spark of defiance, a flicker of the old mischief that had always driven him. No, he thought, I am more than this. With a grunt of effort, Loki pushed himself up onto his knees, his body shaking from the strain. The doppelganger watched him with amusement, its grin widening. Oh, it said mockingly, still fighting, are we? Loki looked up at the creature, his eyes burning with a newfound resolve. You may be right about me, he said, his voice hoarse but steady. I've lied. I've tricked. I've betrayed. But you know what? That's who I am. The doppelganger's smile faltered, just for a moment. Loki rose to his feet, his legs unsteady but holding firm. I am Loki, he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I am the god of mischief, and yes, I've made mistakes. I've done terrible things, but I am not a nothing thing. The doppelganger snarled, its eyes narrowing. You think defiance will save you? Loki smiled, a real smile this time, not the forced mask he had worn for so long. Defiance is all I have left. With that, Loki raised his hand, and for the first time since entering the void, he summoned his magic. The air around him crackled with energy, and the void trembled as if recoiling from his power. The doppelganger lunged at him, but this time, Loki was ready. With a flick of his wrist, he cast an illusion, a shimmering, shifting veil of light and shadow that enveloped the creature, distorting its form. Hermes stood in the mausoleum's darkened corridor, his back pressed against the cold stone wall as Loki staggered out from the Gate of Souls. The trickster god's eyes, still haunted by whatever horrors he had confronted within, betrayed no sense of triumph. His usual cocky demeanor had been stripped away, leaving behind only raw exhaustion and a thin veneer of defiance. For once, Loki had nothing clever to say. He looked as though he had been torn apart and stitched back together, barely holding on to the fragments of himself. His smile, a hollow thing, flashed briefly as he met Hermes' eyes, but it faded as quickly as it had come. Loki nodded at Alecto, acknowledging her silent question with an equally silent answer. I survived. Hermes could feel the weight in the air, as if the very realm they stood in had grown heavier with each trial. It was as though the mausoleum itself knew what was happening within its walls, as though the ancient stones were watching, waiting for the next to step forward. Waiting for him. You're up, messenger boy, Loki rasped, his voice raw from whatever trial he had endured. Time to face your demons. Hermes inhaled sharply, his chest tightening. The weight of that simple statement was not lost on him. He knew this moment was coming. He had always known. But now, standing at the threshold of the Gate of Souls, with Alecto and Loki having passed their judgments, the reality of what he was about to face crashed over him like a tidal wave. Hermes glanced toward Alecto. She stood with her wings folded, her posture stiff and solemn, as though she had been carved from stone. Her gaze was distant, her thoughts clearly still lingering on her own trial. Whatever darkness Alecto had faced, she had emerged stronger, but it was a quiet strength, a fragile sort of resilience that only just held the cracks of her soul together. He had to go in next. It was his turn. Without another word, Hermes pushed himself off the wall and stepped toward the towering stone doors of the Gate of Souls. Anubis, silent as always, watched him from the side, his jackal's eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He said nothing, offering no words of advice or warning. It wasn't necessary. Hermes knew exactly what awaited him on the other side of that door, or at least he thought he did. As Hermes approached the gate, he placed his hand on the cold, weathered stone. The surface was rough beneath his fingertips, etched with ancient hieroglyphs and symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The door seemed to pulse beneath his touch, alive with the ancient magic that governed the judgments within. The air hummed with energy, and Hermes felt a strange, uncomfortable pull, as though the very fabric of reality was shifting around him. With a deep breath, Hermes stepped through the threshold. Darkness swallowed him whole. Hermes had expected the transition to be jarring, perhaps a plunge into nothingness, like Loki's trial, or a landscape as serene and deceptive as Alecto's. But what greeted him was different. It wasn't the void that engulfed him, nor was it any physical realm. It was something far more unsettling. Hermes found himself floating in a place that defied description, where time itself seemed to flicker and bend. The sky, or what passed for the sky, was a swirling mass of colors that bled into one another, forming an endless, chaotic canvas. Beneath him, the ground shifted constantly, as though it couldn't decide whether to be solid or liquid. One moment, he was standing on firm earth. The next, he was sinking into a river of memories, swirling images of his past flashing before his eyes. He was in the space between moments. The space where gods like him existed, always running, always moving, never pausing to reflect. The messenger of the gods had no time to dwell on his actions, no time to think about the consequences of his choices. But here, in this liminal space, there was nowhere to run, no path to escape. Hermes was trapped in the eternal present, where every decision he had ever made looped back around to confront him. The first memory rose up from the ground like a specter, unfolding before him as though he were watching it happen all over again. It was the moment when he had delivered the news of the Trojan Wars beginning to Zeus, his father. Hermes had always prided himself on his role as the intermediary between gods and mortals, the one who carried the weight of fate on his winged sandals. But watching himself from the outside, he saw something different. In the memory, Zeus sat upon his golden throne, his eyes cold and distant as Hermes delivered the news of war. The messenger had spoken the words with practiced indifference, as though the fates of thousands of mortals were nothing more than pieces on a divine chessboard. He had smiled, proud to be of service, proud to be the trusted herald of Olympus. But now, standing outside the memory, Hermes saw the truth, the casual cruelty in his own voice, the way he had disregarded the lives of the mortals he was meant to serve. He had carried the message, yes, but he had never considered the cost. You think yourself above them, a voice whispered from the void around him. It was his own voice, distorted and twisted, laced with venom. You deliver the will of the gods, but you never consider the consequences. Hermes turned, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Only the swirling colors and shifting ground beneath him. The memory before him shifted again, this time to a moment he had buried deep within his mind. It was the day of his greatest shame. Hermes watched in horror as the scene played out. The day he had led the souls of the fallen from the fields of battle in Troy to the underworld. He had done it without hesitation, guiding the spirits of the dead with a calm, unflinching smile. But now, in this twisted reflection of the past, he saw the truth. The dead had not been ready. They had not understood what had happened to them. They had been frightened, confused, desperate to cling to the lives they had just lost. And Hermes had led them without question, his role as psychopomp more important to him than the suffering of those he guided. Did you ever stop to wonder what it felt like for them? The voice taunted, did you ever think about the terror in their eyes, the way their souls cried out for mercy as you herded them like cattle? No, Hermes whispered, his voice trembling. No, I was just doing my duty. Duty, the voice sneered. A convenient excuse for a god who has never cared about the mortals beneath him. The colors around him shifted again, and now the images of the dead flickered before him like ghosts. Their faces were twisted in pain and fear, their eyes wide with terror as they reached out to him, their hands clawing at the air. Hermes staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always prided himself on his speed, on his ability to move through the world without being touched by it. But here, in this space between moments, he was trapped. The weight of his past was crushing him, suffocating him. You think you're better than them, the voice said again, growing louder. But you're no different. You run from the truth, just like every mortal. You run and you run, but you can never escape. The ground beneath him shifted again, and Hermes fell to his knees, the images of the dead swirling around him like a storm. Their voices rose in a cacophony of despair, a chorus of accusations that pierced through him like knives. I was just doing my duty, Hermes gasped, his hands clutching at his chest as though trying to keep his heart from shattering. I was following orders. The voice laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. And that absolves you, does it? Does that make you blameless? You carried the weight of the god's will, but you never carried the burden of your own actions. You never cared about the consequences because you were always running, always moving. But now, the voice grew louder, deafening now, as the swirling storm of memories closed in on him. Now, you cannot run. Now, you must face the truth. Hermes' breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurring as the weight of the storm pressed down on him. The faces of the dead surrounded him, their eyes filled with accusation, their eyes reaching out for him, pulling him down, dragging him into the abyss. "I'm sorry," Hermes whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, the storm paused, the voices of the dead falling silent. "Sorry?" The voice said, softer now, but no less venomous. "Sorry is not enough." The storm began to close in again, the images of the dead tightening around him like a noose. Hermes' heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. He had always been fast enough to outrun anything, to escape any danger, but here, in this space between moments, there was no escape. And that was when he realized the truth. There was no running from this. Hermes knelt in the storm of swirling memories, his heart thundering in his chest as the dead encircled him. Their eyes, once filled with terror and confusion as they had crossed from life into death, now burned with accusation and judgment. Their hands reached for him, not in the pleading, grasping way of the desperate, but with the cold, steady touch of those who had already condemned him. There was no mercy here. The weight of his past pressed down on him, a suffocating force that threatened to bury him where he knelt. All of his life, Hermes had been in motion, flitting between realms, between mortals and gods, always running, always carrying messages, but never staying long enough to see the consequences of his actions. He had prided himself on his speed, on the fact that nothing could catch him. But here, in the heart of this judgment, there was nowhere left to run. The weight of his choices, of his indifference, bore down on him like chains, each link forged from the souls he had guided without care. For the first time in his long existence, Hermes truly understood what it meant to be still, and it terrified him. The voice that had tormented him, the cruel, mocking echo of his own conscience, was silent now, but its presence lingered in the air around him. It had led him to this point, stripped him of his bravado, his pride, and his quicksilver wit. Now, all that was left was the truth he had spent centuries running from. And the truth was this: he had never cared, not truly. Yes, he had performed his duties. He had carried the will of the gods, delivered their messages, led souls to the underworld, but he had done so without thinking, without feeling. He had seen mortals as fleeting things, lives that burned bright for a moment before flickering out like candles in the wind. They had been little more than playthings to the gods, and Hermes had been content to be the messenger, the intermediary who never lingered long enough to feel the weight of the lives he touched. But now, kneeling in the storm of his own past, he felt that weight with crushing clarity. Every soul he had led, every message he had delivered that had led to war, death, or suffering. They were all here, surrounding him, demanding that he answer for his actions. Hermes squeezed his eyes shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The chains of guilt tightened around him, pulling him down, dragging him toward the abyss that yawned beneath his feet. His hands trembled as he clutched at the ground, trying to find some purchase, some way to stop the inexorable pull of judgment. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the howling winds of the storm. "I never meant to." The dead did not respond. Their faces remained cold, impassive, as they continued to press in on him. Their judgment was already past. Hermes's apologies, his regrets, meant nothing to them. The time for words was long past. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, and Hermes felt himself being pulled downward. The earth opened up in a violent tremor, and he was swallowed whole by the darkness. Hermes tumbled through the void, his body weightless as he fell deeper and deeper into the abyss. The storm of memories faded, replaced by an all-consuming darkness that pressed in on him from every side. The air was cold and thick, like the breath of the underworld itself, and it filled his lungs with each panicked gasp. He had no idea how long he fell. Time lost all meaning in this place, and Hermes, the god who had once mastered the passage of moments, was now at its mercy. The further he fell, the more distant his past seemed, as though the weight of his own judgment was dragging him away from everything he had once known. And then, with a bone-jarring thud, he hit the ground. Hermes groaned, pain flaring through his body as he lay sprawled on the cold, hard surface. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs felt heavy, as though the weight of his guilt had manifested in his very bones. His body ached with the effort, and for a moment he considered staying where he was, letting the darkness consume him entirely. But something in him refused to surrender. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps it was the stubborn refusal to be defeated by his own past. Whatever it was, it forced him to his knees, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. As Hermes looked around, he realized he was no longer in the swirling chaos of his memories. The abyss had deposited him in a new place, one that was eerily familiar yet profoundly unsettling. He was standing in a vast, desolate plain, the ground beneath his feet cracked and barren. The sky above was a deep, oppressive black, with no stars or moon to offer light. In the distance, jagged mountains loomed, their peaks shrouded in mist. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, and every breath Hermes took felt like an effort to swallow the remnants of something long dead. This was not the underworld. At least not the underworld as Hermes had known it. It was something older, something deeper, a place where the souls of the damned were not simply punished but forgotten entirely, a place where gods like him, who had lived their lives in fleeting moments, were forced to confront eternity. Hermes staggered to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He had no idea where he was or how he had ended up here, but he knew one thing for certain. This was part of his judgment, There would be no escaping this place until he faced whatever truth awaited him here. With great effort, Hermes began to walk. The plain stretched on for what seemed like miles, and with each step, Hermes felt the weight of the air pressing down on him, making it harder and harder to move. His legs grew heavy, his muscles protesting with every step, but he forced himself to continue. He didn't know what awaited him at the end of this journey, but he knew he couldn't stop now. As he walked, the landscape began to shift around him. The barren ground beneath his feet gave way to cracked stone, and in the distance he could see something rising out of the earth. An enormous structure, ancient and crumbling, but unmistakably divine in its design. It was a temple, or what was left of one. The closer Hermes got, the more the details of the temple became clear. Its walls were made of dark stone, covered in intricate carvings of gods and mortals, their faces twisted in expressions of torment. Pillars rose up on either side, but many of them had collapsed, leaving only fragments behind. The entrance was framed by two enormous statues, both of them shattered and worn by time. This place was ancient, older than even Hermes could comprehend, and as he approached the entrance, he felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen this place before, not in reality, but in his dreams. In the fleeting moments between sleep and wakefulness, when the mind wandered to places it didn't belong. This temple had haunted his dreams for centuries, always just out of reach, a place of shadows and whispers that filled him with dread. And now, here he was, standing at its threshold. Hermes hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to go inside. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back, to flee from this place and never return. But he knew there was no turning back. Not now. With a deep breath, Hermes stepped into the temple. The air inside was cold and damp, and his footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space. The walls were lined with torches, their flames flickering weakly as though they had been burning for millennia without being tended. The carvings on the walls grew more elaborate the deeper he went, depicting scenes of gods and mortals locked in an eternal struggle for power. But what struck Hermes the most were the mirrors. They lined the walls of the temple, tall and narrow, their surfaces polished to a perfect sheen. As Hermes passed by them, he caught glimpses of his own reflection, his face pale and drawn, his eyes haunted by the weight of his judgment. But there was something wrong with the reflections. They didn't move with him. Instead, they lingered in the mirrors, watching him with cold, accusatory eyes. Each mirror seemed to hold a different version of himself. In one, he was the confident, smiling messenger of the gods, his winged sandals glinting in the light. In another, he was the weary psychocomp, guiding souls to the underworld with a grim expression. In yet another, he was a child, frightened and alone, running from something he couldn't see. But in every reflection, there was something missing, some vital spark of life that made him who he was. As Hermes walked deeper into the temple, the mirrors grew larger and more elaborate, their frames carved with symbols and runes he couldn't read. The reflections inside them shifted and warped, showing him things he didn't want to see. Images of himself as a failure, as a coward, as someone who had never truly cared about anything. The cold air within the temple clung to Hermes like a shroud, its damp chill seeping into his bones. The temple felt alive, though not in the vibrant, divine sense of a god's domain. No, this place was different, forgotten and decaying, yet pulsing with a dark, sentient energy. Each step echoed, the sound bouncing off the ancient stone walls, only to be absorbed into the oppressive silence. As Hermes ventured further down the long corridor, the mirrors lining the walls seemed to grow more ominous. The reflections no longer mimicked his movements. Instead, they stood frozen, staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. These versions of himself, shifting, warping, and changing with every step, seemed less like reflections and more like accusations made manifest. Their eyes followed him, unblinking, as if they were waiting for him to make a mistake, to stumble, to break. But he wouldn't break, not yet. Hermes swallowed hard and pressed on, his heart pounding in his chest, a steady drumbeat of fear that he fought to keep under control. He had faced dangers before, demons, monsters, and even the wrath of the gods themselves. But this was different. Here, in this strange ancient place, there were no enemies to fight, no battles to win. The war was internal, and Hermes was not certain he could emerge victorious. As the path before him began to twist and descend into darker chambers, the reflections within the mirrors began to change once more. No longer did they show him as he was. They showed him as he might have been or could still become. In one mirror, he saw himself as a broken man, his winged sandals discarded in the dirt, his once proud features hollowed by despair. His face, gaunt and pale, bore the look of someone who had given up, someone who had been running for so long that the idea of stopping had never occurred to him. His eyes, dull and lifeless, stared back at him without recognition, as if he were already forgotten by the world he had once served. Hermes shuddered and tore his gaze away from the image, but the next mirror offered no reprieve. This time, he saw himself as a god of cruelty. His face was twisted into a sneer of contempt, his eyes filled with cold malice as he stood over the bodies of those who had dared to challenge him. His hands, covered in blood, clutched his caduceus staff, but it was no longer a symbol of healing and guidance. It was a weapon. A twisted, jagged thing used to destroy rather than protect. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. These reflections were not just idle visions. They were possibilities, versions of himself that could have existed, or perhaps still did in some hidden corner of his soul. They were the consequences of every choice he had made, every moment where he had turned a blind eye to the suffering he had caused. "Is this who I am?" Hermes whispered to the empty air, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "Or is this who I could become?" The temple offered no answer, but the reflections continued to shift and swirl, each one more grotesque and terrifying than the last. The confrontation of the past. Suddenly, The corridor ended, opening into a vast circular chamber. In the center of the chamber stood a massive ornate mirror, taller than any Hermes had seen before, its frame carved with ancient symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. This mirror was different from the others. It radiated power, a deep, unsettling energy that hummed in the air, vibrating through the stone beneath his feet. Hermes approached the mirror slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The reflection that awaited him there was not the same as the others. It was not distorted or twisted. It was him, just him, as he had always appeared in the eyes of the world, the messenger of the gods, the fleet-footed one, the guide of souls. But something was different, something in the reflection's eyes. He stepped closer, his breath shallow, and stared into his own eyes. The reflection stared back, its gaze unwavering. But as Hermes examined himself, he noticed something horrifying. The reflection was empty. It was him, yes, but without the spark of life, the essence that made him who he was. There was no passion, no purpose, no drive. His eyes were dull. His expression flat, as though the soul had been stripped from his body, leaving behind only a hollow shell. And as Hermes stared, he realized with growing dread that this reflection, this version of himself, was closer to the truth than he had ever wanted to admit. For all his speed, for all his cleverness and wit, for all the lives he had touched as he raced between the mortal and divine worlds, Hermes had never truly lived. He had always been in motion, always moving from one place to the next, one task to the next, without ever stopping to consider why, without ever asking himself what he wanted, or who he really was beyond the role the gods had given him. The hollow reflection stared back at him, its emptiness a silent accusation. "You've never stopped," always whispered from behind him. Hermes spun around, his heart skipping a beat, but there was no one there. The chamber was empty, save for the mirrors lining the walls. "You've always been running," the voice continued, soft but insistent, as though it was coming from the air itself, running from yourself. Hermes swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't know what you mean." "You do," the voice replied, and this time Hermes realized it wasn't coming from the air at all. It was coming from the mirror. He turned back toward the massive, ornate mirror, his pulse quickening. The reflection was no longer still. It was moving slowly, deliberately, stepping toward him as though it were alive. "You've been running from this," the reflection said, its voice cold and hollow, yet undeniably his own. "From who you are, from what you've done." Hermes took a step back, his breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. I've done my duty. I've always done what was asked of me." The reflection sneered, its eyes narrowing with contempt. "Your duty? Is that what you call it? Leading souls to their deaths without a second thought, delivering messages that bring war and suffering. You've never cared, Hermes. You've never stopped long enough to care." Hermes faltered, the words catching in his throat. The reflection was right. He had never stopped to think about the consequences of his actions. He had never questioned the orders he had been given, never considered the lives he had affected. He had simply done what was expected of him, without hesitation, without remorse. The reflection stepped closer, its voice growing colder. You've always been running, always moving, because you're too afraid to face the truth, too afraid to look at yourself and see what you really are. Hermes shook his head, his heart pounding. No, I'm not afraid. Yes, you are. The reflection hissed, its eyes blazing with accusation. You're terrified. You've always been terrified. That's why you run. That's why you never stop. Because if you stop, you'll have to face it. Face what? Hermes shouted, his voice breaking. What am I supposed to face? Yourself. The reflection whispered, its voice barely audible. For a moment, the chamber was silent, the weight of the words hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. Hermes felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow as the enormity of the truth settled over him. He had spent his entire existence running, not just from the gods, not just from the mortals he served, but from himself, from the guilt, the shame, the fear that had always been lurking beneath the surface. He had never stopped long enough to confront it, to confront who he really was. And now, in this temple of mirrors, there was no escaping it. The reflection moved closer still, until it was standing directly in front of him, its cold, empty eyes locked onto his. You've been running for so long, Hermes, it whispered. But you can't run forever. Sooner or later, you have to stop. Hermes felt a lump rise in his throat, his hands trembling at his sides. He wanted to run. He wanted to turn and flee from this place, from this horrifying confrontation with himself. But the temple's ancient power held him there, rooted him to the spot, forcing him to face the truth he had been avoiding for so long. Tears welled up in his eyes, and for the first time in his long, immortal life, Hermes felt utterly, completely helpless. I don't know how to stop, he whispered, his voice trembling. I've never known how. The reflection's expression softened. Its eyes filled with something that almost resembled pity. You don't have to know how. You just have to try. Hermes stood frozen before the towering mirror, his reflection still staring back at him, cold, detached, and hollow. The weight of his entire existence hung heavy around him, the burden of centuries of guilt and avoidance crashing down on him in waves. He had always been fast enough to escape this moment, fast enough to outrun everything, his regrets, his responsibilities, even himself. But now, in the cold, oppressive silence of the ancient temple, there was no running left to do. The reflection, his reflection, spoke again, though its voice now held a strange softness, a mournful undertone that hadn't been there before. You've spent your life in motion, Hermes, running from one task to the next, always moving, always chasing, always. Fleeing. Hermes could hear the sorrow in his own voice, and it unnerved him. Was this how the world saw him? a messenger without rest, a god of speed who never took the time to understand his impact. The reality of it pressed down on him like a lead weight. "I did what I had to," Hermes whispered, his voice strained. "I followed the will of the gods, carried their messages, guided the dead. What else was I supposed to do?" His reflection's eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest hint of anger rippling through its face. "You could have stopped. You could have listened to the souls you guided, understood the consequences of your words and actions. But you never cared. You never gave them a second thought. To you, they were just tasks, but they were people." The truth of it stung, sharp and brutal. Hermes had always prided himself on efficiency, on his ability to carry out the will of the gods without delay or distraction. He had seen himself as a vital part of the divine order, indispensable, always moving forward. But in doing so, he had become something less than a god. He had become a tool. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the reflection's accusing gaze, but the weight of his guilt lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. "You're right," Hermes whispered, his voice cracking. "I never cared. I never let myself care. I thought it would make me weak. I thought if I stopped long enough to feel, I'd lose what made me useful." The reflection's face softened, its anger melting away into something more tender, more sorrowful. "And look where that has brought you," it said quietly. "A god without purpose, a hollow messenger running from the very truth that could set you free." The words hung in the air like a noose, tightening around Hermes' chest. The truth he had always feared to face was undeniable now. He had been running not from his duties or from the gods, but from himself. From the fear that beneath his divine title, he was nothing, just a fleeting, aimless thing, defined only by the speed at which he could escape his own emptiness. But now there was no escape. The truth had caught up with him, and it was staring him in the face. "I don't know how to stop," Hermes admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." The reflection smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "You don't have to run anymore, Hermes. You don't have to be fast. You just have to be fast. You just have to wait of what you've done, of who you are. Only then can you find peace." Hermes swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. Could it really be that simple? After centuries of running, of never standing still, could the answer to his salvation be found in the very thing he had avoided his entire life? Stillness, acceptance. But how could he stop now? After so long, how could he bear to face the weight of his own existence, knowing the damage he had done? Hermes clenched his fists, his body trembling with the intensity of his emotions. How do I live with it? How do I live with the things I've done? The reflection stepped closer, its eyes filled with a strange, quiet compassion. You don't live with it. You carry it. Just like every soul you've ever guided, every message you've ever delivered, you carry the weight of your choices. It will be heavy, but it will also be real. For the first time in your life, Hermes, you will truly exist. The words resonated deep within Hermes, striking at something raw and vulnerable inside him. His whole life, he had been defined by his speed, by his ability to move forward without hesitation. But now, faced with the prospect of slowing down, of embracing the weight of his own choices, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been running in the wrong direction all along. A tear slipped down his cheek, hot and bitter, and he didn't bother to wipe it away. For the first time in his long existence, Hermes let himself feel the full weight of his own guilt, his own regret. He let it wash over him, let it settle deep in his bones until he was no longer running from it, but carrying it. And as the weight of his past settled over him like a mantle, something extraordinary happened. The mirror in front of him shimmered, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. The reflection of his hollow self began to dissolve, its edges blurring and melting away until it was nothing more than a faint outline in the glass. In its place, another reflection emerged, this one more solid, more real. It was Hermes, but not the god he had been before. This Hermes was different. He still wore the winged sandals and carried the caduceus staff, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes now, a weight that had never been there before. He looked whole, complete. For the first time, Hermes saw himself not as a god defined by his speed or his duty, but as a being capable of feeling, of carrying the weight of his own existence without being crushed by it. The reflection smiled softly, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Hermes smiled back. The air around Hermes shifted, growing lighter, as if the oppressive weight of the temple had lifted along with his burden. The mirrors lining the chamber walls no longer showed the twisted, distorted versions of himself. They now reflected only the truth. Hermes as he was, a god who had finally stopped running. He turned away from the great mirror and took a deep breath, his lungs filling with the cool, musty air of the temple. There was no more fear now, no more guilt gnawing at the edges of his soul. It was still there, of course, the weight of his choices, the knowledge of the lives he had touched in ways both good and bad, but it no longer felt like a burden he couldn't bear. It was simply part who he was. Hermes glanced toward the entrance of the chamber, where the path back to the main corridor awaited him. He knew what he had to do now. His trial was not over, but the hardest part was behind him. As he made his way back through the corridor, past the mirrors that no longer held his past mistakes, Hermes felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had faced his truth, and though it had nearly broken him, he had come out the other side stronger for it. When he finally reached the exit of the temple and stepped out into the open air, the landscape of the forgotten realm stretched out before him, vast and silent. The jagged mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist, but the oppressive weight of the place no longer filled him with dread. He turned and saw Anubis standing by the stone archway, his jackal head tilted slightly, his glowing eyes observing Hermes with quiet interest. "You faced your judgment, Anubis said, his voice as deep and resonant as ever. Hermes nodded. I have. And what have you learned? Hermes paused, the question hanging in the air. What had he learned? So many things, and yet one truth stood out above all the others. I've learned that I don't need to run anymore. Hermes said softly, his voice filled with a new, hard-won clarity. I've spent my life moving forward, never stopping to think about who I am or what I've done. But now I understand. I can't outrun my past. I have to carry it with me. Anubis studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, the god of the dead stepped aside, allowing Hermes to pass. You may continue, Anubis said, his voice quiet but firm. The path forward is yours to take. Hermes felt a strange sense of relief as he stepped past Anubis and began walking along the narrow trail that led out of the temple grounds. For the first time in his life, he wasn't racing ahead, wasn't trying to outrun anything. He was simply moving forward, one step at a time. As Hermes made his way back toward the main chamber, where Alecto and Loki awaited him, the weight of the trial still fresh in his mind, he wondered how they had fared in their own judgments. What truths had they been forced to face? Hermes walked with an unhurried pace, his footsteps quiet on the crumbling stone path. For once in his long existence, there was no need to rush, no need to outpace time itself. The weight of his recent trial still sat heavy in his chest, but it no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it felt grounding. He had faced the truth of himself and survived. He had carried souls to the underworld, delivered messages that brought about war and death, and had run from the consequences all his life. But now, he carried those burdens willingly. As he approached the central chamber where he had last seen Alecto and Loki, he wondered what they had seen, what trials had stripped them bare, as his had done to him. He had felt it in their eyes when he'd stepped into the gate of souls. Alecto had borne the weight of her judgment stoically, but her eyes had been haunted, a shadow of something deep and personal lurking there. And Loki, who hid behind laughter and sarcasm, had emerged from his trial looking shaken, as though even his own tricks couldn't save him from the truth of his reflection. The air grew heavier as he neared the chamber. The silence that enveloped the forgotten realm was unnatural, oppressive. There were no birds, no wind, no sound of life at all. Just the distant, almost imperceptible hum of ancient magic that seeped from the temple itself, weaving through the stones and casting long, creeping shadows across the cracked ground. Finally, the path opened into the vast central chamber, where the flickering torches threw dim light across the smooth stone floor. Alecto stood in the center of the room, her wings tucked tightly against her back, her posture rigid, as though she were trying to contain something within herself. She stared at nothing, her gaze unfocused, lost in her own thoughts. Loki was seated on a broken column, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. His head was lowered, his fingers idly tracing patterns in the dust. The usual spark of mischief in his eyes was absent, replaced by a distant, almost somber expression. He didn't even notice Hermes approaching. Neither of them looked at each other. There was a heavy, unspoken tension between them, an understanding that they had all seen too much, faced too much to simply speak it aloud. Hermes cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence as he stepped fully into the chamber. Alecto's gaze snapped to him, her eyes dark and weary. Loki glanced up, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. Well, Loki said, his voice rasping as though it hadn't been used in hours. Hermes offered a small, tired smile. It seems I've taken my time this once. Loki chuckled softly, though there was no real humor in the sound. You're not the only one who's learned something about time. Alecto said nothing, her eyes searching Hermes' face as though she were looking for something, an answer, a reassurance, or perhaps just the simple confirmation that he, too, had been through his own torment. "You've faced your judgment," Alecto finally said, her voice low and even, though there was an edge to it that betrayed her internal struggle. Hermes nodded. "I have. And you?" Alecto's gaze flickered to the ground for a moment before she met his eye again. "It's done. I've seen what I needed to see." There was a long pause as the weight of her words settled between them. Alecto was not one to reveal her thoughts easily, and whatever she had faced within the Gate of Souls had clearly left a mark. But Hermes knew better than to press her. She would speak when she was ready, if she ever was. Loki, on the other hand, had no such reservations. He stood from the column and stretched his arms above his head, his movements languid, though there was a tension in his muscles that betrayed his true feelings. "Well, now that we've all been properly traumatized by our own reflections, shall we get on with this little quest of ours?" Loki said, his voice flippant, but the weariness behind it was unmistakable. Alecto shot him a sharp look, her jaw tightening. "This isn't something you can joke away, Loki." Loki's smirk faltered, and for a moment his eyes darkened. "I'm not joking," he said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual playfulness. "But I also know that standing around in this temple, reliving our failures, won't change anything. We have a job to do, so let's do it." Hermes exchanged a glance with Alecto, silently acknowledging the truth in Loki's words. Despite everything they had faced, despite the harsh judgments that had nearly broken them, they still had a mission. The prophecy still hung over them like a dark cloud, and the heart of the cosmos still lay somewhere ahead, waiting for them to claim it. But Hermes could feel it now, more than ever. The heart was no simple artifact. It wasn't just a tool to restore their power, to bring them back to their former glory. It was something more, something dangerous. The temple had shown him that much. This wasn't just a journey to reclaim what they had lost. This was a test, a final reckoning for gods who had been forgotten by the world, and not all of them would survive it. They stood in silence for a while longer, the gravity of the situation pressing down on them like the weight of the temple itself. Hermes could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. He had faced his own reflection, seen the emptiness that lurked within him, and accepted it. But he knew that Alecto and Loki carried their own burdens, and he wondered what they had seen in the mirrors of their souls. "What did you see?" Hermes asked, his voice soft, hesitant. Loki glanced at him, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, Hermes thought he wouldn't answer, but then the trickster god sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I saw myself," Loki said, his voice quiet, "but not as I am. As I could be, as I've tried so hard not to become." Hermes waited, sensing that Loki wasn't finished. "I've spent my life weaving lies, tricking gods and mortals alike," Loki continued, his tone bitter. "But the worst lie I ever told was the one I told myself, that I could control it, that I could control it, that I could bend the chaos to my will without letting it consume me." He paused, his eyes distant, lost in the memories of his trial. "But the truth is, I've been running from my own nature all along. I can't control it. I never could." Hermes felt a pang of sympathy for Loki, something he hadn't expected. They had never been close, never shared more than the occasional jest or cutting remark. But now, standing together in the aftermath of their judgments, Hermes saw a vulnerability in Loki that he had never seen before. The trickster god, always so confident, so sure of himself, had been forced to confront his own limits, and it had shaken him to his core. "And you?" Hermes asked, turning to Alecto. "What did you see?" Alecto's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she looked away. "It doesn't matter," she said coldly. "What I saw is between me and the fates." Her words were sharp, cutting off any further questions, but Hermes could see the pain behind them. Whatever Alecto had faced in the Gate of Souls, it had wounded her deeply, and she wasn't ready to share that wound with anyone. Not even them. Loki raised an eyebrow, clearly wanting to press her, but a glance from Hermes stopped him. There was no point in pushing Alecto further. She would reveal her truth when she was ready, or not at all. The air around them shifted, growing colder, as though the temple itself was responding to their presence. Hermes could feel it now. The pull of the prophecy, the weight of destiny pressing down on them. It was a subtle, insistent force, tugging at his senses, urging him forward. They had come this far, endured the trials of their own souls, but the real journey was only just beginning. "The heart of the cosmos is still ahead," Hermes said quietly, his gaze fixed on the distant shadows that stretched out beyond the chamber. "Whatever waits for us there, it won't be easy." "Nothing ever is," Loki muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. Alecto's wings shifted slightly, the faint rustle of feathers breaking the heavy silence. "We didn't come here because it was easy," she said, her voice hard and resolute. "We came because it's the only way. If we fail, we'll be forgotten." erased. The truth of her words hung in the air like a death sentence. Failure was not an option. They had been forgotten by the world, their power diminished, their names fading from the lips of mortals. The air grew colder as the gods stepped deeper into the temple's shadows, leaving behind the chamber where they had each faced their own reflections. The corridor ahead was narrow, its walls etched with ancient symbols that glowed faintly, casting flickering shadows across the rough stone floor. There was an unmistakable tension in the air now, a quiet hum of anticipation that thrummed just beneath the surface of reality. Hermes could feel it in his bones, the pull of the prophecy, the weight of destiny pressing harder with each step. It was as though the temple itself was alive, aware of their presence, guiding them forward toward the final trial that awaited. The heart of the cosmos lay ahead, and with it the culmination of their journey. Yet even now, with the end in sight, Hermes felt a gnawing sense of unease, a creeping doubt that settled deep in his gut. They were walking into something none of them fully understood. The trials they had faced within the Gate of Souls had tested their resolve, forced them to confront their own weaknesses, their own truths. But this final trial, the heart, was different. It would not simply test them, it would determine their fate. "I don't like this," Loki muttered, breaking the tense silence. His voice was low, laced with suspicion. He walked just behind Hermes, his sharp eyes scanning the walls as though expecting a trap to spring at any moment. "There's something wrong here. It feels too quiet." "It's a temple," Alecto replied curtly from the front of the group, her wings shifting slightly as she spoke. "It's supposed to be quiet." Loki shot her a withering glance. "I'm not talking about the lack of noise. Fury, I'm talking about the feeling." He waved a hand through the air, his fingers brushing against the invisible tension that clung to them like mist. "It's like the calm before a storm. You feel it, don't you?" Hermes nodded, though he kept his thoughts to himself. Loki wasn't wrong. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, a sense of anticipation that made his skin prickle. It felt as though the very fabric of the temple was waiting, watching for something to happen. "We're nearing the end," Alecto said, her voice steady despite the tension that crackled between them. "The heart is close. Whatever happens next, we face it together." Hermes glanced at Alecto, sensing the unspoken weight behind her words. There had been a shift in her demeanor since her trial in the Gate of Souls, a hardening of her resolve. She had always been a fierce, uncompromising force, an avenger of the gods, a judge of mortals. But now there was something more in her eyes, a determination born not just from duty, but from a deeper, more personal place. Whatever she had seen in her trial, it had solidified her purpose. Loki, however, seemed less certain. He kept his distance from both Hermes and Alecto, his usual bravado tempered by the lingering effects of his own judgment. There was an edge to him now, a quiet tension that hinted at a deeper fear he had yet to fully confront. "Do you think the heart will give us what we want?" Loki asked, his voice softer than usual. "What we need?" Hermes didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he didn't know. The heart of the cosmos was a mystery, even to him. They had followed the prophecy, endured the trials, and come this far with the hope that the heart would restore them, return them to their former glory. But as they neared the end of their journey, Hermes found himself questioning everything they had assumed about the artifact. "It's not about what we want," Hermes said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "It's about what we're willing to sacrifice." Alecto glanced over her shoulder, her gaze sharp. "Sacrifice." Hermes nodded, his expression grim. The prophecy never said the heart would simply restore our power. It's a test, a final judgment. We may not come out of this as the gods we once were. Loki scoffed softly, though there was no humor in his voice. Then why go through all this trouble? What's the point of seeking the heart if it won't return us to what we once were? Alecto stopped walking, turning to face them fully. Her eyes were hard, unyielding, but there was a flicker of something deeper beneath the surface, something raw and vulnerable. "The point," she said slowly, "is survival. We've been forgotten by the world, our names fading from the lips of mortals. Our power has waned, but we're still here. We still exist, and that means something. The heart may not restore us to our former glory, but it will decide if we have a place in this world at all." Her words hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of what was truly at stake. This wasn't just a quest for power. It was a fight for existence. If they failed, they wouldn't just lose their chance at restoration. They would be erased, forgotten completely. Hermes exchanged a glance with Loki, who remained uncharacteristically silent. There was nothing left to say. They had come too far to turn back now, and whatever doubts they harbored had to be set aside. The path ahead would reveal the truth, whether they were ready for it or not. The corridor narrowed as they descended deeper into the temple, the light from the walls growing dimmer, more erratic, as though the energy that powered it was beginning to wane. The tension in the air thickened, the very atmosphere pressing down on them with each step. And then, without warning, the corridor opened into a vast circular chamber. Hermes stopped short, his breath catching in his throat as he took in the sight before him. The chamber was immense, its ceiling disappearing into the shadows high above. The walls were lined with intricate carvings, depicting scenes of creation, destruction, and rebirth. Images of gods long forgotten, their stories etched into the stone like ancient memories. But it was the object in the center of the room that held his attention. The heart of the cosmos. It floated above a stone pedestal, suspended in the air by a force Hermes couldn't comprehend. The heart was not a physical object in the traditional sense. It was a swirling mass of light and energy, constantly shifting and changing, its form never settling into anything solid. Colors bled into one another, a kaleidoscope of brilliance that pulsed with a rhythm. Hermes could feel in his chest, in his very bones. It was alive. The power emanating from it was palpable, a steady thrumming force that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of reality. Hermes felt it immediately. A pull, a deep, instinctual yearning that tugged at the core of his being. The heart was calling to him, to all of them. Alecto stepped forward first, her eyes locked on the heart, her face set in a mask of determination. She approached the pedestal slowly, her wings twitching slightly as though reacting to the energy in the air. Loki followed, though more hesitantly. His eyes flickered with suspicion, wariness. He had always been the cautious one, the trickster who never fully trusted anything or anyone. And now, faced with the raw power of the heart, he looked more uncertain than ever. Hermes took a step forward, his body moving almost of its own accord, drawn to the heart's energy. It was unlike anything he had ever felt, a power so vast, so infinite, that it defied comprehension. It was creation and destruction, life and death, all bound together in a single pulsating entity. "This is it," Alecto whispered, her voice barely audible over the thrumming energy of the heart of the cosmos. Hermes nodded, though he couldn't tear his eyes away from the swirling mass of light. It was mesmerizing, intoxicating even. He could feel its power calling to him, offering him something more than just restoration. It offered answers to the questions that had plagued him since the moment he had stepped into the gate of souls. But there was danger here too. The heart was not just a source of power. It was a test, a judgment. It had the power to restore them, yes, but it also had the power to destroy them. And as Hermes stared into its shifting depths, he realized that the final trial was not about who could wield the heart's power, but who was worthy of it. "What do we do now?" Loki asked, his voice tight with unease. "We decide," Alecto said simply, her gaze never leaving the heart. "The heart is a test. It will judge us, decide if we're worthy to continue, but we have to make the choice." "The choice to do what?" Loki pressed, his voice rising in frustration. "What exactly are we supposed to choose?" Hermes understood now. The heart wasn't just offering them power, it was offering them a choice that would determine their fate, their place in the world, and the very nature of their existence. "We choose whether we accept what we are," Hermes said softly, his voice filled with the weight of the realization. The chamber was filled with an overwhelming, pulsating energy, each heartbeat of the heart of the cosmos vibrating through the air, through the stone beneath their feet, and through the gods themselves. Hermes, Loki, and Alecto stood in its presence, each drawn to its power in different ways, yet all bound by the same weight, the final decision they would have to make. The heart wasn't merely an artifact, it was a force beyond understanding, a living embodiment of creation and destruction, offering them a chance to reclaim their place in the universe, or to fade into nothingness forever. Hermes felt the pull most keenly now, a deep yearning in his chest as he stared into the swirling vortex of light and energy before him. He had spent his life in constant motion, carrying the messages of gods, guiding the dead, and delivering the will of powers greater than himself. He had never truly paused to reflect on his own existence, never questioned the purpose behind his ceaseless running. But here, in the presence of the heart, he felt the weight of his choices and the consequences of every step he had taken. It was no longer about survival, no longer just about reclaiming their power. This final moment was about defining who they truly were and what they would become. Hermes stepped forward, his heart pounding as he approached the heart. The thrumming of its energy intensified as he drew closer, the brilliance of the light nearly blinding him. "What does it want?" Loki muttered, his voice taut with uncertainty. He lingered behind Hermes, his eyes wide with suspicion, his usual arrogance stripped away in the face of something he couldn't outwit or deceive. "It's not about what it wants," Alecto replied, her voice low and steady. "It's about what we're willing to offer. The heart isn't here to grant us power. It's here to judge us." Loki scoffed, though his bravado seemed hollow. "Judge us? For what? We've already faced our judgments. We've seen our worst selves. What more is there?" Hermes understood now. The trials they had endured in the Gate of Souls, the reflections they had faced, were only the beginning. The heart of the cosmos wasn't just a test of their power, it was a test of their souls. "Everything," Hermes said quietly, "it's judging everything we've done, everything we are. This isn't about power, it's about whether we deserve to exist." Loki's expression faltered, and for the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. The trickster god had always been able to manipulate others, to twist the truth and bend reality to his will. But here, in the presence of the heart, there was no room for tricks, no illusions, only truth. Alecto stepped forward, her gaze locked on the heart, her wings twitching slightly as though reacting to the immense power radiating from the swirling mass of energy. Her face was set in a mask of determination, but there was something deeper in her eyes, a vulnerability, a quiet acceptance of the burden she carried. "We've been forgotten by the world," Alecto said, her voice calm but firm. "Our names, our power, our purpose, it's all faded. We came here seeking the heart, hoping it would restore what we've lost. But that's not what this is about. This is about deciding if we're worthy of continuing, if we deserve to exist in a world that no longer remembers us." Loki stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the heart. "And if we're not? Then we'll fade," Alecto said simply. "We'll be erased." The weight of her words settled over them like a shroud. There was no escaping the truth now. They were at the mercy of something far greater than themselves, something that would judge them not based on their past power, but on the choices they made in this moment. Hermes turned his gaze back to the heart, the swirling vortex of light and energy mesmerizing in its complexity. It wasn't just a source of power. It was a reflection of the universe itself. He could feel the pull of it in his very soul, as though the heart was offering him a choice. A voice, silent yet deafening, echoed in his mind. "What do you offer?" Hermes closed his eyes, his thoughts racing. What could he offer? He had spent his entire existence running, moving from one place to the next, delivering messages, guiding souls, but never truly stopping to consider his own purpose. He had never questioned his role as God, until now. In the depths of his trial within the Gate of Souls, he had been forced to confront his own emptiness, the hollow shell of a god who had never truly lived. He had faced the truth that he had been running, not just from his duties, but from himself. And now, in this final moment, the heart was asking him to decide if he could continue, if he could accept who he was and find a new way forward. "I offer myself," Hermes whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of the words. "Not as I was, but as I am. A god who is willing to stop running." The moment he spoke the words, the heart pulsed, its light intensifying for a brief moment before returning to its steady rhythm. It was as though it had acknowledged his offering, accepted it. Alecto stepped forward next, her eyes fixed on the heart with unflinching determination. She had always been the one who judged others, who brought punishment to those who deserved it. But now, in this final moment, she stood before a power that would judge her. "I offer my vengeance," Alecto said, her voice strong but filled with a quiet sadness. "I have spent my existence punishing others, bringing justice to those who have wronged the gods, but I have never allowed myself to feel anything beyond that duty. I've been a weapon, a force of retribution, but I cannot be that anymore." The heart pulsed again, brighter this time, as though it were absorbing her words, taking them in. Loki hesitated. He stood before the heart, his usual confidence shattered by the enormity of the moment. He had always been the trickster, the one who could manipulate and deceive his way through any situation. But here, in the presence of the heart, there was no trick, no game to play. He stared into the swirling light, his hands clenched at his sides, his face tight with uncertainty. For so long, he had defined himself by his ability to create chaos, to bend reality to his will. But now, the heart was asking for something more. It was asking him to offer the one thing he had never been willing to give: himself. "I offer." Loki's voice faltered, and for a moment, Hermes thought he might turn away. But then, with a deep breath, Loki continued, "I offer the truth. No more lies, no more tricks. Just the truth of who I am." The heart's light flared once more, brighter than before, its energy radiating outward in a wave that washed over all of them. The room trembled, the stone beneath their feet vibrating as the heart responded to their offerings. For a long moment, the chamber was silent, the only sound the steady, rhythmic pulse of the heart as it absorbed their words, their truths. And then, slowly, the light of the heart began to change. The swirling vortex of energy that had once been chaotic and unpredictable now shifted, becoming more focused, more stable. The colors that had bled into one another began to coalesce into a single brilliant point of light, shining with a purity that took Hermes' breath away. The heart was no longer a reflection of chaos. It was a beacon of order, of purpose. Hermes felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a mantle, the air thick with the energy of the heart's judgment. This was the final trial, the moment that would decide if they were worthy of continuing, if they had truly accepted their place in the universe. The light pulsed once more, and in that moment, Hermes felt something shift deep within him. It was as though the very core of his being was being unraveled and rewoven, transformed by the heart's power. He could feel the burden of his past, the ceaseless running, the hollow existence he had once known, fall away, replaced by something new. He had offered himself, and the heart had accepted. Alecto gasped softly beside him, her wings twitching as the light washed over her. Hermes glanced at her, and for the first time he saw not the vengeful fury, but something softer, something more human. She had let go of her anger, her need for retribution, and in doing so she had found a new kind of strength. Loki stood silently, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. He had offered the truth, and though it had been the hardest thing for him to do, the heart had accepted it. There were no more tricks, no more deceptions, just the raw, unfiltered truth of who he was. The heart pulsed one final time, its light growing brighter and brighter until it filled the entire chamber with a blinding brilliance. Hermes shielded his eyes, the intensity of the light overwhelming, but he felt no fear. This was the moment of judgment, the final decision of the heart. And then, just as suddenly as it had flared, the light dimmed, fading away until the chamber was bathed in a soft, gentle glow. The heart of the cosmos floated before them, its energy now calm, serene. The final judgment had been passed. Hermes opened his eyes, blinking against the afterglow of the heart's light. The chamber was silent once more, the oppressive tension that had filled the air now gone. There was a stillness, a quiet peace that seemed to settle over them all. Alecto took a deep breath, her wings unfurling slightly, as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She turned to Hermes, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. "We did it," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and wonder. "We passed the judgment." Hermes nodded, though his mind was still reeling from the experience. The heart had judged them, not for their power or their past, but for their willingness to accept the truth of who they were. And in that acceptance, they had found their place in the universe once more. Loki remained silent, his gaze fixed on the heart as though he couldn't quite believe what had happened. For so long, he had lived in the shadows of lies and deception, never allowing anyone to see the real him. But now, in this final moment, he had offered the one thing he had always withheld, the truth, and the heart had accepted it. As the light of the heart continued to fade, Hermes felt a sense of closure settle over him. Their journey had not been easy. Far from it. They had faced their darkest selves, confronted the truths they had spent lifetimes running from. But now, In the wake of the heart's judgment, they had found something more valuable than power. They had found themselves. We may not be the gods we once were, Hermes said softly, his voice carrying through the chamber, but we are still here. We still exist, and that means something. Alecto nodded, her gaze steady. We've been forgotten by the world, but we've reclaimed our purpose. We've found a way forward. Loki, for once, said nothing, but there was a quiet acceptance in his eyes, a recognition that they had all been changed by the journey they had taken together. The heart of the cosmos continued to pulse softly, its light now a gentle glow that filled the chamber with warmth. It had given them what they needed, not the restoration of their former power, but the chance to define themselves on their own terms. And in that moment, Hermes realized that they had found something far more valuable than they had ever expected. They had found the truth. As the three gods turned away from the heart and began their journey back to the world that had forgotten them, Hermes felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He had finally stopped running. He had accepted himself, and that was enough.